The night sky over the northern cape of South Africa burns with more stars than seems possible, a cosmic canopy so dense and brilliant that the Milky Way casts shadows across the red sand of the Kalahari Desert. On the 7th of May, 1989, witnesses scattered across this vast and empty landscape watched something that did not belong among those ancient constellations. At approximately 8:45 in the evening, a massive fireball tore across the darkness, traveling from east to west with such intensity that it turned night into day across hundreds of square kilometers. Farmhands working late near the Botswana border stopped mid-task, their faces lit by an orange glow that seemed to set the atmosphere itself on fire. In the small settlements dotting this isolated region, families emerged from their homes to witness what some initially thought must be an aircraft in distress, while others, more familiar with the peculiar silences of the desert, knew immediately that this was something different, something that defied easy explanation. The object moved with purpose, cutting through the sky at impossible speed, trailing a luminous tail that painted the heavens in shades of amber and crimson. Then came the explosion. Witnesses describe a thunderous detonation that rolled across the Kalahari like the voice of some ancient god awakened from slumber beneath the sand. The sound reached settlements more than 30 kilometers away, rattling windows and sending livestock into panic chaos. Those closest to the impact site reported feeling the ground shudder, a physical tremor that traveled through earth and bone alike. Within hours, the South African Defense Force had descended upon the region with a speed and coordination that suggested either remarkable efficiency or prior preparation. Military convoys sealed off an area spanning hundreds of square kilometers around the suspected crash site. Roadblocks appeared on dirt tracks that rarely saw official attention. Helicopters thundered overhead through the following days, their searchlights sweeping the desert floor in geometric patterns. The message was clear and absolute. No one was to approach. No one was to ask questions. In the settlements and farms surrounding the exclusion zone, rumors began to spread with the infectious quality that only genuine mystery can generate. Workers who had been in the area spoke in hushed tones of something metallic being loaded onto flatbed trucks under armed guard, of canvas tarps stretched over objects with geometric shapes that caught the moonlight in ways that seemed almost liquid. Some claimed the recovered object was disc-shaped, others insisted it was cylindrical. All agreed that whatever left the Kalahari under military escort was treated with a reverence and security typically reserved for nuclear materials or heads of state. The timing could not have been more provocative. May of 1989 placed this incident at the twilight of the Cold War, a moment when decades of secrecy and shadow operations were beginning to crack, but had not yet shattered. South Africa itself existed in a state of international isolation, its apartheid government operating with a paranoia born of both external sanctions and internal resistance. The military infrastructure had grown powerful and secretive, accustomed to operations that would never see official acknowledgement. Into this atmosphere of institutional secrecy fell something from the sky, something that the Defense Force deemed worth mobilizing substantial resources to recover and conceal. What crashed in the Kalahari that night? The question hangs in the air like the dust that never quite settles in the desert wind. Official channels offered nothing. No statements, no explanations, not even a denial that anything unusual had occurred. This silence, more than any wild claim or leaked document, fuels the enduring mystery. In a region where military exercises and aircraft activity were routine enough to merit at least perfunctory explanation, the absolute void of official response speaks volumes. The witnesses remain, scattered across South Africa and Botswana, their testimonies remarkably consistent despite the passage of decades. They know what they saw. The fireball was real. The explosion was real. The military lockdown that transformed a forgotten corner of the Kalahari into forbidden territory was undeniably real. And somewhere in the gap between what fell from the sky and what was carried away under armed guard lies a truth that someone, whether governmental or military or something else entirely, has worked very hard to keep buried beneath the red sand and the silent stars. The sun was already climbing above the horizon when Petrus Snell heard it, a sound like nothing he had experienced in his 47 years of farming the arid land near Kalahari Gemsbok National Park. It started as a low rumble, distant at first, then building into a roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his boots. Petrus dropped his tools and looked up, shielding his eyes against the bright morning sky. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. An object, massive and impossibly bright, was tearing through the atmosphere above him. Its surface glowed with an intense orange light that hurt to look at directly. Thick black smoke trailed behind it, creating a dark scar across the pristine blue of the early morning sky. But what struck Petrus most was not the object itself, but how it moved. This was no meteor following a predictable arc toward Earth. The thing was changing direction, banking at angles that defied everything he knew about physics and falling objects. It would descend rapidly, then level out, then bank hard to the right before resuming its plunge toward the distant hills. Petrus was not alone in his observations. Throughout the Northern Cape region on that May morning in 1989, dozens of witnesses watched the same impossible sight. Their testimonies, collected in the days and weeks following the incident before the threats began, paint a remarkably consistent picture. This consistency across multiple independent witnesses is what gives their accounts such credibility, even decades later. Johannes Smith, a diamond mine worker finishing his night shift at a facility approximately 60 kilometers from the eventual crash site, described seeing what he initially thought was a burning aircraft. But as he watched, transfixed, he realized no aircraft could maneuver like this object did. It seemed to be under some kind of intelligent control, attempting to slow its descent or perhaps searching for a suitable landing area. The orange glow was so intense that Johannes could make out details of its shape, which he described as somewhere between a perfect sphere and a flattened disc. The surface appeared metallic, possibly reflecting the early morning light, but the orange glow seemed to emanate from within the object itself. Sarah Boshoff, a school teacher living in a small town along the main road, was preparing breakfast for her family when her daughter called out from the backyard. Sarah rushed outside to find her 7-year-old pointing at the sky with wonder and fear mixed on her young face. Together, they watched the glowing object streak overhead, low enough that Sarah could hear the tremendous roaring sound it made as it passed. She would later tell investigators that she felt a wave of heat wash over her, though the object was still several hundred meters above ground. The windows of her house rattled in their frames, and her radio, which had been playing softly in the kitchen, suddenly erupted in harsh static before going completely silent. The electromagnetic disturbances began immediately. Kobus van den Merwe, a truck driver heading south on the main highway, found his diesel engine suddenly sputtering and dying. His radio squealed with interference, and the compass on his dashboard spun wildly before settling in a direction that was clearly not north. As he coasted to a stop on the shoulder, Kobus witnessed the object pass over the hills to his east, so low now that he could no longer see the top of its arc. A few seconds later, he felt more than heard a deep, resonating thud that seemed to travel through the earth itself. A thin column of dark smoke began rising from beyond the hills. What happened next is where the story takes its darker turn. Within hours, witnesses throughout the region began noticing unusual military activity. Willem Botha, a sheep farmer whose land bordered the crash site, was among the first to see them arrive. He had been riding out to investigate the smoke column when he encountered a convoy of South African Air Force vehicles racing across the desert terrain. Heavy trucks with military markings, several helicopters flying in formation, and soldiers carrying serious hardware. Willem tried to approach, curious about what had fallen on or near his property, but was turned back at gunpoint by soldiers who offered no explanation beyond terse orders to leave the area immediately. By mid-afternoon, roadblocks had appeared on every approach to the crash site. Official-looking men in suits, not military uniforms, were stopping vehicles and questioning drivers. Had they seen anything unusual? Had they taken any photographs? Several witnesses reported having their camera film confiscated, though the men provided no receipts or official documentation for what amounted to government seizure of private property. The message was clear even when not explicitly stated: forget what you saw. But in small communities, word travels fast. By evening, most residents of the surrounding towns knew that something significant had crashed in the desert, and that the military was going to extreme lengths to control information about it. Some witnesses who persisted in discussing the incident publicly received more direct warnings. Petrus Nell, the farmer who had been one of the first to see the object, was visited 2 days later by men who identified themselves only as government security. They sat in his kitchen and explained, with carefully chosen words that nevertheless carried unmistakable menace, that spreading rumors about military exercises could be considered a security violation. They knew details about his farm, his family, his financial situation. The implicit threat was clear enough. Yet despite these intimidation tactics, stories continued to circulate, particularly about what happened in the days following the crash. The strangeness did not end with the object's impact. Farmers in the area surrounding the crash site began reporting dead livestock. Not one or two animals, which might be explained by disease or predators, but entire herds found lifeless in their pasture. The animals showed no obvious signs of injury or illness. They simply appeared to have dropped dead simultaneously. Veterinarians who examined some of the carcasses found elevated radiation levels, though these findings were never officially documented or explained. Francois Liu, whose cattle farm was located approximately 10 kilometers from the impact site, discovered 32 of his best breeding cows dead in a single morning. The animals were arranged in what appeared to be a rough circular pattern, all facing outward from a central point. The grass beneath and around them was scorched, burned in perfect circles that overlapped to create a flower-like pattern. Francois had seen plenty of drought-killed vegetation in his years of farming, but this was different. The earth itself seemed fused, almost glassy in texture at the centers of the circles. He took samples, planning to have them analyzed, but the samples disappeared from his truck while he was in town purchasing feed. When he returned to his farm, 2 of the military trucks were parked in his driveway. The electromagnetic disturbances continued for days. Radio communications throughout the region became unreliable, with broadcasts interrupted by strange tones, and what some described as voices speaking in no recognizable language. Vehicle problems plagued the area, with cars and trucks experiencing unexplained electrical failures. Watches stopped working or began running at wildly incorrect speeds. One elderly resident reported that his grandfather clock, which had kept perfect time for 60 years, suddenly began running backwards. Local doctor Anna Visser documented several patients complaining of unusual symptoms in the week following the crash. Severe headaches, nosebleeds, temporary vision problems, and a persistent ringing in the ears. Most troubling were 3 cases of what appeared to be radiation poisoning, though none of the patients had any known exposure to radioactive materials. When Dr. Visser attempted to report these cases to provincial health authorities, she was told firmly that her patients were suffering from a local flu outbreak, and that further reports would be considered medical malpractice. The military presence remained heavy for nearly 2 weeks. Helicopters conducted regular patrols over the crash site and surrounding areas. Large covered trucks were seen leaving the location, their loads concealed beneath heavy tarps. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was brought in, along with what appeared to be hazmat-suited personnel operating detection equipment. A temporary fence was erected around a 5-kilometer perimeter, guarded 24 hours a day. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the military withdrew. The roadblocks disappeared overnight. The helicopters stopped their patrols. The only evidence of the massive operation was the scorched earth at the impact site and the deep tire tracks crisscrossing the desert landscape. Official statements claimed the entire incident involved a military aircraft that had crashed during routine exercises. The wreckage had been recovered, the area cleared, and there was no danger to the public. Questions from local journalists were deflected or ignored entirely. But those who had witnessed the object's descent knew better. They had seen something that was not a conventional aircraft, something that moved in ways that challenged the known laws of physics. They had watched as their government mobilized a massive response operation, as their neighbors were threatened and silenced, as evidence was seized and destroyed. And they lived with the aftermath: the dead animals, the scorched earth, the lingering health effects that doctors refused to acknowledge. Decades later, many of these witnesses still live in the region. Some have passed away, taking their detailed memories with them. Others remain, now elderly, still willing to share their accounts with anyone who will listen. Their stories have not changed with time, a fact that lends them additional credibility. The details they provide remain consistent, specific, and troublingly plausible. They speak not as people seeking attention or inventing tales, but but as individuals who witnessed something extraordinary and were then systematically silenced by their own government. The year 1989. While the world watched the Berlin Wall crumble and celebrated the supposed end of the Cold War, another story was unfolding in the shadows of the Southern Hemisphere. A story that would remain buried beneath layers of classification, diplomatic silence, and the deliberate chaos of a nation in transition. This is the story of South Africa, at the edge of an abyss, a country so wrapped in secrecy and paranoia that it became the perfect location for something the world was never meant to discover. To understand what allegedly happened in the restricted zones of the Northern Cape, you must first understand the South Africa of that era. This was not merely a nation dealing with internal strife. This was a militarized state operating under international isolation, a country that had weaponized secrecy itself. The apartheid government had transformed the entire nation into a fortress, where information was as carefully controlled as the movement of people across color-coded zones. The South African Defense Force in 1989 was not simply a military organization. It was a state within a state, commanding resources that dwarfed many nations' entire budgets. While the world condemned apartheid, few realized that sanctions had driven South Africa to develop a level of self-sufficiency that bordered on the paranoid. The SADF operated its own intelligence networks, its own weapons development programs, and most significantly, its own nuclear program that officially didn't exist. By the late 1980s, South Africa had successfully tested 6 nuclear devices. 6 weapons that the international community knew about only through whispers and satellite imagery. The Armscor Corporation and the Atomic Energy Board had created an arsenal in absolute secrecy, built-in facilities hidden in the vast emptiness of the Kalahari Desert. These weren't crude devices. Intelligence reports suggested they were sophisticated weapons, compact enough to be delivered by the Cheetah fighter bombers that the SADF flew on missions that never appeared in any official record. But the nuclear program was just one layer of the security apparatus. The SADF maintained specialized retrieval units, teams whose very existence was compartmentalized beyond top-secret classification. These units operated under names that shifted with each operation, drawing personnel from the reconnaissance commandos, from 32 Battalion, from units so classified that members couldn't acknowledge their service even to their families. Their training went beyond conventional special operations. They were trained in what the military euphemistically called sensitive material recovery. What exactly did that mean? Former members who have spoken off the record describe operations where they were deployed to crash sites with orders to secure everything before any other entity, military or civilian, could arrive. They describe being trained in handling materials that required protective equipment, in establishing immediate perimeters, in removing all evidence that anything had occurred. One former operator described an exercise where his team was given 4 hours to make a simulated crash site completely disappear, including removing all debris, all scorched earth, all physical evidence. They completed the task in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The border war was winding down by 1989, but the military infrastructure remained at full operational capacity. Angola to the north, Namibia to the northwest, and the vast Atlantic coastline to the west, all were monitored by some of the most sophisticated radar and signals intelligence equipment that the Western world had provided during friendlier times. South Africa had become a listening post for NATO during the height of the Cold War, tracking Soviet naval movements, monitoring submarine activity, watching the skies for anything that shouldn't be there. And this is where the story turns from documented history into something darker, something that exists in fragmentary reports and heavily redacted documents that have surfaced over the decades since. Operation Silent Storm. The name appears in exactly 3 declassified documents from American military intelligence archives. Each reference is brief, each heavily redacted. The first mentions a joint operation protocol established in 1987 between SADF Special Operations and an unnamed American intelligence entity. The second is a logistics record showing specialized equipment transferred to a South African military installation in the Northern Cape in May of 1989. The third is a communication log that simply notes Silent Storm activated with a date in August of 1989. What was Silent Storm? According to sources who claim knowledge of the operation, It was a standing agreement between American military intelligence and the South African government. An agreement that if certain types of incidents occurred over southern African airspace, there would be immediate coordination, immediate lockdown, and absolute silence. The sources claim this wasn't about conventional threats. This was about something else entirely. The radar tracking reports are more concrete, though their interpretation remains disputed. In the early hours of August 15, 1989, multiple NATO naval radar installations in the South Atlantic registered an object. The accounts vary depending on which leaked report you examine, but the consistent elements are striking. An object traveling at extraordinary speed, at an altitude that fluctuated wildly, crossing into the radar coverage zone from the direction of the Antarctic. Operators at the American radar station on Ascension Island reportedly tracked the object for 11 minutes. During that time, its altitude dropped from approximately 100,000 feet to under 20,000 feet. Its speed decreased from what radar operators described as impossible velocities to roughly 2,000 miles per hour. The trajectory was consistent with something losing power, losing control, or both. The object crossed into African airspace somewhere over the desolate coastline where Namibia meets the Atlantic. What happened next exists only in the accounts of those who claim to have been there, in the fragmented testimonies collected over decades by researchers who have made this incident their obsession. They speak of a scramble order that went out to a specialized SADF unit stationed at a facility near Upington. They describe transport helicopters lifting off in the middle of the night, heading northwest toward the restricted diamond mining zones that formed a perfect cover for any military operation. The Sperrgebied, the Forbidden Zone. Here was a region already sealed off from the world, patrolled by private security forces, protecting diamond mining interests, overlapping with military restricted areas related to the nuclear testing sites. A place where unauthorized access could earn you years in prison, or simply result in your disappearance. Where the desert stretched in every direction, where months could pass without a single civilian witness, where the military could move freely under the cover of protecting national economic interests. Multiple sources claim that American personnel were on the ground within 18 hours. Not officially, of course. South Africa in 1989 was still under sanctions, still ostracized by the international community. But the intelligence relationship had never truly ended. When it mattered, when something significant enough occurred, the channels remained open. The cover story was ready-made. The region was already restricted. Any unusual military activity could be attributed to the ongoing border war, to anti-poaching operations, to exercises related to the nuclear program. The apartheid government had perfected the art of keeping secrets. In a nation where information was controlled at every level, where the media operated under strict censorship, where entire populations could be moved or removed without questions being asked, concealing one more secret was simply routine. What makes this incident particularly compelling is not just the classified operation claims or the radar reports. It's the context that makes it plausible. This was a nation that had successfully hidden a nuclear weapons program for over a decade. A military that routinely conducted operations across international borders without acknowledgement. A government so paranoid about foreign surveillance that it had built an entire security apparatus designed to detect and counter any intelligence-gathering attempt. If any place on Earth in 1989 could make something disappear completely, it was apartheid South Africa. The pieces fit together with disturbing coherence. A sophisticated radar network capable of tracking objects at extreme altitudes. Military units trained specifically in sensitive material recovery. A vast restricted zone where operations could be conducted without civilian oversight. An intelligence relationship with the United States that operated in the shadows despite official sanctions. And a government that would cease to exist in its current form within just a few years, taking its secrets with it into the chaos of transition. As South Africa moved toward its historic transformation, as Nelson Mandela walked free and the apparatus of apartheid began to dismantle, something else was happening. Documents were being destroyed. Facilities were being decommissioned. The nuclear weapons were dismantled, supposedly the first nation to voluntarily give up its arsenal. But what else disappeared in that transition? What other secrets were buried in the rush to create a new nation from the ashes of the old? The truth remains locked away if it exists at all. But the framework was there. The capability was there. The motivation to keep secrets was there. In the paranoid final years of apartheid South Africa, in a military state that had mastered the art of concealment, in a vast restricted zone where nothing was as it seemed, something may have fallen from the sky. And if it did, it fell into exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, for it to vanish forever. In the late summer of 1997, a series of photographs began circulating through the underground networks of UFO researchers and military conspiracy theorists, images that would ignite one of the most heated debates in the already contentious history of the Kalahari Incident. These weren't the typical blurry lights in the sky or ambiguous shadows that so often characterized alleged extraterrestrial evidence. These photographs depicted something far more tangible, far more troubling, something that demanded explanation one way or another. The man behind these controversial images was James Van Greunen, a former officer in the South African Defense Force, who emerged from decades of silence with a story that would either vindicate years of speculation or represent one of the most elaborate hoaxes in modern ufology. Van Greunen claimed to have been part of the initial recovery team dispatched to the remote Kalahari location in May of 1989, and the photographs he presented to the world were, according to his account, taken during those first critical hours after the object's retrieval. The images themselves possessed an unsettling quality that transcended their technical limitations, grainy and somewhat faded, as if they had been hidden away for years before seeing daylight. They showed what appeared to be a massive metallic sphere, partially embedded in the distinctive red sand of the Kalahari Desert. The object's surface was unlike anything in conventional aerospace engineering, a seamless expanse of silver that seemed to catch and reflect the harsh African sunlight in ways that made it difficult to focus on directly. No rivets, no welds, no panel lines, nothing that suggested human manufacture or assembly. Just an unbroken metallic skin that appeared almost organic in its perfection. The scale of the object was perhaps the most striking element captured in these photographs. Van Greunen estimated the sphere to be approximately 15 to 20 meters in diameter. Around its base, the red Kalahari sand had been displaced and scattered, forming irregular patterns that suggested a violent impact. Yet, the sphere itself appeared remarkably intact. No visible damage, no scorching, no signs of atmospheric entry that one would expect from an object that had supposedly fallen from space at tremendous velocity. But it was the figures surrounding the object that transformed these photographs from curious anomalies into documents of profound significance. Military personnel, in what Van Greunen described as hazmat-style suits, moved around the sphere with obvious caution, their white protective gear standing in stark contrast to the red desert sand and silver sphere. Some appeared to be taking measurements, others documenting the scene, while still others seemed to be establishing a perimeter. The body language of these figures, even filtered through grainy photography, conveyed a palpable sense of uncertainty and tension. These were not men casually investigating a weather balloon or experimental aircraft. These were people confronting something they did not understand. Van Greunen's testimony provided disturbing context for what the photographs could not fully convey. He described arriving at the scene in the early morning hours, part of a rapidly assembled team that had been given minimal briefing about what they would encounter. The object, he claimed, was still emitting a low-frequency hum when they arrived, a sound that he described as being felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate in the chest cavity and create a sense of deep unease among the recovery team. Several members of the initial approach team reportedly experienced nausea and disorientation, symptoms that were later attributed to possible exposure to unknown radiation or electromagnetic field. The temperature of the sphere presented another anomaly that Van Greunen emphasized repeatedly in his accounts. Despite having allegedly been at the site for several hours since impact, the metallic surface remained warm to the touch, not burning hot as one might expect from atmospheric friction, but maintaining a consistent warmth that seemed to emanate from within the structure itself. Thermal imaging equipment, according to Van Greunen, detected unusual heat signatures across the sphere's surface, patterns that defied conventional explanation and suggested some kind of internal power source that remained active even after the craft's apparent crash. The photographs Van Greunen provided showed various angles of the recovery operation, each image adding layers to the narrative while simultaneously raising new questions. One particular photograph depicted what appeared to be an opening or hatch in the lower portion of the sphere, a darker area that suggested access to the interior. Van Greunen claimed that this opening was discovered several hours into the recovery operation, and that what was found inside would change everything about how they approached the retrieval. It was through this opening, Van Greunen alleged, that the recovery team discovered the occupants. According to his testimony, 2 beings were found near the craft, though he remained frustratingly vague about whether they were discovered inside or outside the sphere itself. His descriptions of these entities would become some of the most controversial and disputed elements of his entire account. He described them as smaller than average humans, perhaps 1.2 to 1.4 meters in height, with proportions that seemed wrong to the human eye. Large craniums, slender limbs, and skin that Van Greunen described as having a grayish or pale quality that might have been natural coloring or the result of their condition. The fate of these beings became a central and haunting element of Van Greunen's story. He claimed that at least one of them showed signs of life when first discovered, though the nature of those signs remained unclear in his telling. Both entities were quickly removed from the scene by what he described as a specialized team that arrived separately from the initial recovery operation, personnel who seemed to have been expecting exactly what had been found. The beings were placed in sealed containers and transported to an unknown facility, a destination that Van Greunen claimed was never revealed to the majority of the recovery team. The removal of these entities, according to Van Greunen, was conducted with extraordinary secrecy and speed. Within hours of their discovery, they had vanished from the site, leaving only the sphere itself and a recovery team that had been given strict instructions about what they had and had not seen. Van Greunen described an atmosphere of intense pressure and barely concealed threat, with senior officers making it abundantly clear that silence was not optional, but mandatory. In the days and weeks that followed the recovery operation, Van Greunen claimed to have witnessed the systematic dismantling and removal of the sphere itself. The object was reportedly cut into sections using specialized equipment, a process that he described as difficult and time-consuming, as if the metal resisted conventional cutting tools. These sections were then transported to unknown locations, presumably for analysis and study. Van Greunen's role in the operation apparently ended at this point, and he returned to his regular duties with the understanding that the Kalahari Incident, as far as official records were concerned, had never occurred. For years, Van Greunen maintained the silence that had been demanded of him. But by the mid-1990s, as South Africa underwent dramatic political transformation, and the old structures of the apartheid-era military began to crumble, he began to feel that the truth could and should be revealed. He made contact with several researchers in the UFO community, initially providing only vague details and hints. But eventually, he produced the photographs, physical evidence that seemed to corroborate at least some elements of the long-rumored Kalahari crash. The reaction to Van Greunen's photographs and testimony was immediate and polarized. Believers in the extraterrestrial hypothesis seized upon them as vindication, the smoking gun that proved government knowledge of and interaction with non-human intelligence. Here, finally, was documentation that moved beyond eyewitness testimony and second-hand accounts. Here were images, physical photographs that could be analyzed, debated, and investigated. But skeptics raised immediate and significant concerns about the authenticity of both Van Greunen's story and his photographic evidence. Photo analysis experts noted inconsistencies in lighting and shadow that suggested possible manipulation or staging. The grain structure of the images seemed inconsistent with the film stock that would have been standard for military documentation in 1989. Some argued that the entire scene could have been created using models and miniatures, a relatively simple hoax for someone with Van Greunen's military background and access to equipment. Van Greunen's personal credibility also came under scrutiny. Investigators attempting to verify his service record encountered difficulties, with some military databases showing gaps or inconsistencies in his claimed postings and assignments. Former colleagues who were tracked down provided conflicting accounts, some confirming his general presence in relevant units during the appropriate time frame, others claiming no memory of him at all. This murkiness might have been the result of legitimate security classifications and record-keeping issues in the chaotic final years of apartheid. Or it might have indicated something more troubling about Van Greunen's truthfulness. The technical details of Van Groenen's account also raised flags among aerospace engineers and physicists. The described behavior of the sphere, its heat retention, the humming sound, the seamless construction, all of these elements seem to align almost too perfectly with popular depictions of alien spacecraft in movies and television. Critics suggested that Van Groenen's story read more like science fiction than a genuine military report, filled with details designed to satisfy UFO enthusiasts rather than reflecting the messy reality of an actual unknown object recovery. Yet, defenders of Van Groenen's authenticity pointed out that this reasoning cut both ways. If someone were inventing a UFO story from whole cloth, wouldn't they be tempted to make it more spectacular, more detailed, more dramatic? Van Groenen's account, while extraordinary, maintained a certain restraint in many respects. He provided no elaborate descriptions of alien technology, no messages from the beings, no grand revelations about their origins or intentions. His story was in many ways frustratingly incomplete, which some argued was exactly what one would expect from a low-level participant in a highly compartmentalized operation. The question of why Van Groenen chose to come forward when he did also generated debate. Some viewed his decision as an act of conscience, a man unburdening himself of a profound secret in his later years. Others saw it as opportunism, a former military officer seeking attention or possibly financial gain from a community eager for validation. Van Groenen gave several paid lectures and interviews in the late 1990s, though he never became wealthy from his claims, and seemed to withdraw from public life relatively quickly. That withdrawal came amid what Van Groenen himself characterized as renewed pressure and threats. In his final interviews before largely disappearing from public view, he spoke of being followed, of receiving threatening phone calls, of former military contacts warning him to cease his disclosures. Whether these threats were real or represented paranoia, or perhaps a convenient excuse to exit the spotlight before his story could be more thoroughly debunked, remains an open question. Van Groenen gave his last recorded interview in early 2000, after which he effectively vanished from the UFO research community, his current whereabouts and status unknown. The photographs he left behind continued to circulate, analyzed and reanalyzed by successive generations of researchers using increasingly sophisticated tools. Some modern photo forensics experts have declared them obvious fakes, pointing to digital artifacts and inconsistency. Others, using different methodologies, have found nothing definitively proving manipulation. The debate remains unresolved, a Rorschach test in which people tend to see confirmation of their existing beliefs rather than objective truth. What makes Van Groenen's photographs particularly significant in the broader context of the Kalahari incident is how they transformed an abstract story into something visceral and immediate. Whether authentic or fabricated, those grainy images of a silver sphere in red sand, surrounded by figures in protective suits, gave visual form to years of rumors and speculation. They forced even skeptics to engage with the possibility, however remote they might consider it, that something extraordinary had occurred in that remote desert location. The psychological impact of photographic evidence, even questionable photographic evidence, should not be underestimated. Human beings are visual creatures, and images carry a weight that testimony alone often cannot match. Van Groenen understood this, whether as a genuine whistleblower or a skilled fabricator, and his photographs ensured that the Kalahari incident would never be forgotten or easily dismissed. In the hazy weeks following the incident that rocked the Kalahari, when official silence had already begun its work of erasure and misdirection, something unusual was happening at South African military installations. Something that would add another layer to the already complex mystery unfolding in the southern African desert. The first reports came from Hoedspruit Air Force Base, nestled in the Limpopo province, roughly 900 kilometers from where witnesses claimed to have seen something come down in flames. Workers at the base, men who had spent years around military aircraft and knew the rhythms of normal operations, began noticing arrivals that didn't fit the usual patterns. Large American military transport planes, their distinctive profiles unmistakable against the African sky, were touching down with increasing frequency. The aircraft bore the markings of the United States Air Force, and they came in under conditions of extraordinary secrecy. A ground crew technician, whose identity remains protected even decades later, reported seeing one such arrival in the pre-dawn hours of late May, 1989. He had been working an overnight shift when the transport touched down, its engines cutting through the stillness of the early morning. What struck him immediately was the security presence. South African military police formed a perimeter around the aircraft the moment it came to rest on the tarmac. No routine inspection, no standard protocols. Just a wall of armed personnel, faces set, refusing entry to anyone without explicit authorization. The technician watched from a distance as cargo was loaded. The operation took hours, conducted with a precision that suggested rehearsal and planning. The cargo itself remained concealed beneath heavy tarps, but the shape was unmistakable to anyone familiar with loading procedures. Something large, something irregular, something that required specialized handling equipment to maneuver into the transport's hold. The workers involved in the actual loading had been brought in from elsewhere. None of the regular base personnel were permitted near the operation. This pattern repeated itself over several weeks. Different witnesses, different bases, but the same essential elements. At Waterkloof Air Force Base near Pretoria, aviation personnel reported similar sightings. At the Vastrap Weapons Testing Range in the Northern Cape, security was suddenly and dramatically increased, with entire sections of the facility placed off limits even to personnel with high-level clearances. And always, there were the American transport planes, arriving and departing on schedules that appeared in no official logs. One cargo handler at Hoedspruit later described what he'd been ordered to help load. The object was contained within a specialized transport container, but through gaps in the covering, he glimpsed something that defied easy categorization. Metallic, certainly, but with a surface texture unlike any aircraft material he'd encountered. The weight distribution was wrong too. The container required reinforcement beyond what standard aircraft debris would demand. When he asked his supervisor about it, he was told in no uncertain terms that his questions were unwelcome and that discussing what he'd seen would have serious consequences for his career and potentially his freedom. Understanding why such cooperation between the United States and South Africa might occur requires examining the geopolitical landscape of the late 1980s. This was a period of complex and often contradictory relationships. Officially, the United States maintained sanctions against the apartheid government, responding to international pressure and domestic calls for action against racial segregation. But beneath the surface of public policy, other currents flowed. The Cold War remained very much alive, and Southern Africa represented a crucial theater in that larger struggle. Soviet influence in Angola, Mozambique, and other neighboring states made South Africa a strategic partner, regardless of its domestic policies. The South African military possessed intelligence networks and operational capabilities that the United States found valuable. And South Africa, increasingly isolated internationally, needed friends wherever it could find them. Into this delicate balance came something unprecedented, an incident that transcended ordinary military or political considerations. If something of potentially extraterrestrial origin had indeed come down in South African territory, both nations had compelling reasons to cooperate on its retrieval and analysis. For South Africa, it meant maintaining crucial ties with American intelligence and military establishments. For the United States, it meant access to material that could prove to be of incalculable scientific and strategic value. Intelligence analysts who later examined this period noted that such cooperation would have occurred at the highest levels of classification, hidden not just from the public, but from most governmental officials. These would have been special access programs, compartmentalized to the point where even cabinet-level officials might be kept unaware. The kind of operations that leave minimal paper trails and operate under budgets buried in classified supplements to defense appropriations. The destination suggested by multiple sources was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, home to what was then the Foreign Technology Division and long rumored to be the ultimate repository for recovered anomalous materials. Wright-Patterson's connection to such phenomena stretched back to the Roswell incident of 1947. For decades, researchers and witnesses had claimed that debris from that event had been transported to the base, where it remained stored in secured facilities, studied by specialists, with clearances that went beyond top secret. The base possessed the infrastructure for such work. Specialized laboratories, testing facilities capable of analyzing unknown materials, and security protocols designed to protect the most sensitive military secrets. If you were going to transport something of potentially extraterrestrial origin from South Africa to the United States, Wright-Patterson would be the logical destination. It had the expertise, the facilities, and most importantly, the institutional experience in handling such matters. But proving any of this would require documentation, official records, some paper trail that confirmed what witnesses claimed to have seen. And it's here that the story takes another troubling turn. When researchers in the late 1990s began filing Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to South African military cooperation during this period, they encountered a familiar obstacle. The records they sought had been destroyed. The official explanation was routine archival purging. Military and intelligence agencies regularly dispose of outdated documents, and the end of the Cold War had triggered massive declassification and destruction effort. Warehouses full of files from defunct operations were being eliminated, part of a broader effort to streamline record-keeping and reduce storage costs. The fact that documents related to South African operations during May of 1989 were caught up in this purge was, according to officials, simply coincidental timing. Researchers found this explanation unconvincing. The destroyed records included files from ongoing intelligence operations, diplomatic communications that should have been preserved as historical record, and technical reports that had potential continuing value. The pattern suggested something more targeted than routine housekeeping. Specific sets of documents from specific time periods related to specific locations, all gone. All destroyed during purges that occurred years after the events in question, but conveniently before persistent inquiries began demanding access. Both the United States and South African governments, when pressed for comment on the alleged retrieval operation, offered blanket denials. There had been no unusual military cooperation during this period beyond routine liaison activities. No American transport aircraft had removed unusual cargo from South African bases. The entire narrative was dismissed as conspiracy theorizing, a fiction constructed from misidentified routine operations and overactive imaginations. When the denials proved insufficient to quiet the questions, a secondary explanation emerged. What witnesses might have seen was the recovery of satellite debris. Both nations operated space surveillance networks, and the late 1980s saw increased satellite activity. Occasionally, components would fall back to Earth, requiring recovery operations under security protocols. This could explain the unusual cargo, the security presence, the American involvement. A mundane explanation for what witnesses had interpreted as something extraordinary. But satellite debris doesn't require weeks of recovery operations. It doesn't necessitate the level of security described by multiple independent witnesses. And it certainly doesn't explain why records of such routine operations would later be systematically destroyed. The satellite explanation raised more questions than it answered, serving more to demonstrate that officials felt compelled to offer some alternative narrative rather than actually illuminating what had occurred. The silence from Pretoria was equally absolute. South African military officials refused to confirm or deny any aspect of the alleged operation. Aviation workers who had spoken about what they'd witnessed found themselves transferred, retired, or otherwise removed from positions where they might continue talking. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. This was not a topic open for discussion. What remains are fragments. Testimony from witnesses whose credibility varies, but whose accounts share common elements. Circumstantial evidence of unusual activity at multiple locations during a compressed time frame. The documented presence of American military aircraft at South African bases, even if the purpose of those visits remains officially unexplained. And the nagging question of why records that might clarify matters no longer exist. The theory of American retrieval and transport to Wright-Patterson remains just that, a theory. But it's one that fits the available evidence, explains the observed patterns, and accounts for the subsequent official behavior. Whether proof will ever emerge, whether documents escape destruction or witnesses will come forward with definitive evidence, remains uncertain. What's clear is that something unusual happened in the skies and on the ground in southern Africa during those weeks in 1989, and the full truth remains locked behind walls of classification and official denial that show no signs of crumbling. The old regime was crumbling, and with it, the walls of secrecy that had held for decades began to crack. When South Africa emerged from the shadow of apartheid in 1994, the transformation brought more than political change. The dismantling of the old government structures created an unexpected phenomenon. Men who had spent their entire careers serving a regime built on control and classification suddenly found themselves adrift in a new nation that no longer demanded their silence. The oaths they had sworn to protect state secrets seemed to dissolve along with the government that had extracted those promises. In the chaos of transition, some of these men began to speak. Among the first to break ranks was Dr. Mohamed Strand, a medical officer who had served in the South African Defense Force during the height of the Cold War era. Strand had maintained his silence for nearly 2 decades, but in 1995, approaching retirement and facing a country transformed beyond recognition, he reached out to a small Cape Town newspaper with a story that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. The journalist who met Strand described him as nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder, chain smoking throughout their 3-hour interview in a quiet restaurant far from the city center. Strand spoke in careful, measured tones about an assignment he had received in May of 1989. He had been stationed at a medical facility near Pretoria when military transport vehicles arrived unannounced in the middle of the night. The base commander ordered him to prepare for an examination of biological materials, but refused to provide any further details about what he would be examining or where these materials had originated. What Strand described seeing that night defied everything his medical training had taught him. The specimens were unlike any terrestrial organism he had encountered in his years of practice. He spoke of tissue samples that possessed a cellular structure fundamentally different from anything found in known taxonomies. The cells themselves seemed wrong, he told the journalist. They were organized in geometric patterns that made no biological sense according to conventional understanding. When he attempted to use standard staining techniques to examine them under microscopy, the samples reacted in ways that confused and disturbed him. Strand claimed he was allowed only 6 hours with the materials before armed personnel removed everything from his laboratory. He was ordered to destroy all notes, to forget what he had seen, and was threatened with court-martial if he ever spoke of the incident. For 6 years he had honored that command. But in the new South Africa, with the old military hierarchy scattered or retired, he felt compelled to reveal what he knew. The newspaper that published his account buried it on page 9. Few paid attention. Strand gave only one more interview to a radio station in Durban before he stopped responding to media requests entirely. When researchers tried to locate him years later, they discovered he had emigrated to Australia in 1997 and refused all further contact on the subject. But Strand's testimony was only the beginning. As the 1990s progressed, other former military personnel began to speak, each adding fragments to a puzzle that remained frustratingly incomplete. Most spoke anonymously, through intermediaries, their identities protected by journalists or researchers, who understood the risks these witnesses faced. They described late-night transport operations in the Kalahari Desert, unusual debris fields cordoned off by military police, and the presence of American advisors who seemed to take control of certain operations while South African personnel were relegated to perimeter security. The most significant revelation came not from a whispered confession or anonymous testimony, but from a deathbed in Johannesburg in 21. General Peter van Deventer had been a towering figure in the old South African Defense Force, a man whose career spanned 4 decades and who had commanded respect, fear, and absolute loyalty from those who served under him. When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2000, he retreated from public life entirely, seeing only family and a few close friends during his final months. Among those friends was a former chaplain who had served on Van Deventer's staff during the 80s. The chaplain, Reverend Johannes Kleinhans, later described sitting with the general during his final days. Van Deventer had been heavily medicated for pain, drifting in and out of lucidity, when he suddenly gripped Kleinhans's hand with surprising strength and began to speak about the Kalahari Incident. According to Kleinhans, the general's words were fragmented but consistent. He spoke of a recovery operation in May of 1989. He confirmed the retrieval of what he called a non-human craft. He described it as unlike any aircraft or missile he had ever encountered in his military career. When Kleinhans pressed for details about what had happened to this craft, Where it had been taken, who had ultimate custody of it? Van Deventer became agitated. He shook his head repeatedly and said only that some knowledge was too dangerous to carry, that he had made promises that extended beyond death. He died 3 days later without elaborating further. Kleinhans struggled with whether to reveal this conversation. He consulted with other clergy, with his own conscience, weighing his duty to a dying man's confidence against what he believed the public had a right to know. In 23, he finally chose to speak publicly, granting an interview to a South African documentary filmmaker. The interview created a brief surge of interest, but without corroborating evidence or additional details, it soon faded from mainstream attention. What could not be easily dismissed, however, was the pattern that began to emerge in the years following these revelations. Those who spoke openly about the Kalahari incident seemed to face consequences that went beyond social ridicule or professional marginalization. In 1998, a former air traffic controller named Deon Viljoen claimed to have tracked an unidentified object on radar screens the night of the incident. He had provided testimony to a civilian research group and was preparing to speak at a conference in Johannesburg. 2 weeks before the conference, Viljoen was killed in what police described as a routine car accident on a stretch of highway he had driven safely for years. Investigators found nothing suspicious, but those familiar with his testimony noted the convenient timing. The following year, a logistics officer who had claimed to have transported unusual materials from the Kalahari to a facility outside Pretoria disappeared while on a hiking trip in the Drakensberg Mountains. Search teams found no trace of him despite extensive efforts. His family insisted he was an experienced outdoorsman who knew the terrain well. In 2002, a radar technician who had been preparing to go public with documentation from the incident was found dead in his Durban apartment. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, though friends and family insisted he had shown no signs of depression and had been excited about finally telling his story. These incidents might have been coincidental. People die in accidents. They go missing in wilderness areas. They take their own lives for reasons those around them never fully understand. But to researchers investigating the Kalahari case, the pattern seemed too consistent to ignore. At least 7 individuals who had claimed direct knowledge of the incident died or disappeared under questionable circumstances between 1997 and 2005. In each case, authorities found no evidence of foul play. In each case, those deaths came at moments when the individuals were preparing to reveal new information. This climate of fear and uncertainty formed the backdrop when Michael Tellinger, a South African researcher and author, decided to conduct an unofficial investigation in 2006. Tellinger had built a reputation as a persistent, meticulous investigator of unexplained phenomena. He approached the Kalahari case with determination to cut through decades of rumor and establish a factual record. What Tellinger encountered was a wall of resistance that seemed coordinated and deliberate. Former military personnel who had spoken cautiously to other researchers refused to meet with him. Those who did agree to preliminary conversations often canceled at the last moment, sometimes claiming they had received warnings from unnamed sources. Tellinger documented numerous instances of what he described as active interference, phones that seemed monitored, interviews interrupted by unexpected visits from individuals who claimed to be conducting routine government business. Most troubling was his experience when he attempted to access public records that should have been available under post-apartheid transparency laws. Military logs, flight records, and incident reports from May of 1989 were either missing from archives, classified under provisions that seemed to contradict new governmental policies, or so heavily redacted as to be meaningless. When Tellinger pressed officials for explanations, he received bureaucratic deflections that led nowhere. He managed to interview 3 former officers who provided off-the-record accounts consistent with earlier testimonies. They spoke of the recovery operation, the presence of foreign military advisors, and the immediate classification of all materials and information. But each refused to speak on camera or provide written statements. One explained that despite the political transformation, certain elements within the military and intelligence services remained unchanged, still loyal to old protocols, and still willing to protect certain secrets, regardless of what government was nominally in power. Tellinger's investigation reached a crucial moment in late 2006, when a source, whom he never publicly identified, provided him with copies of what appeared to be classified military documents from 1989. These documents seem to corroborate key elements of the Kalahari story. References to a recovery operation, mentions of unusual materials requiring specialized containment, and authorization codes for transport to an undisclosed facility. For a brief period, these documents circulated within the research community. Analysts examined them, finding elements that appeared authentic, including proper formatting, classification markings consistent with South African military protocols of that era, and details that aligned with known operations. But before any thorough verification could be completed, the documents disappeared from circulation as quickly as they had appeared. Those who had received copies reported receiving official notices demanding their return under national security provisions. Websites that had posted images of the documents received takedown orders. Tellinger himself was contacted by government officials, who informed him that he was in possession of classified materials and could face prosecution if he did not surrender all copies and cease discussing their contents publicly. The sudden, coordinated response to these leaked documents raised as many questions as the documents themselves. If they were forgeries or hoaxes, why would the government respond with such urgency? If they were authentic, what did their contents reveal that required such aggressive suppression 17 years after the original incident? Tellinger complied with the official demands, surrendering the documents and withdrawing from active investigation of the case. In a final interview given shortly after, he spoke carefully about what he believed his research had revealed: that something significant had occurred in the Kalahari in 1989, that it involved the recovery of materials or objects of unknown origin, and that powerful interests within South Africa's military and intelligence apparatus remained committed to keeping the full truth concealed. The transition from apartheid to democracy had opened a window into secrets the old regime had kept locked away. Through that window, fragmented images emerged: a medical officer's testimony about impossible biological materials, a general's deathbed confession about a non-human craft, a troubling series of deaths among those who tried to speak, and classified documents that surfaced briefly before being sealed away once more. But windows can close as quickly as they open, and by the late 2000s, the opportunity for revelation seemed to have passed, leaving behind only questions and the unsettling certainty that some truths remain too dangerous to tell. The four-wheel drive lurched over another dune, sending fine red sand cascading down its windward face like water. Dr. Sarah Mitchell gripped the handle above the passenger door, her eyes fixed on the GPS unit mounted to the dashboard. The coordinates had taken 3 years to compile, pieced together from witness testimonies that contradicted each other in the details, but aligned with uncanny precision on location. Former South African Air Force personnel, local farmers, American intelligence sources who spoke only on condition of anonymity. All of them, when pressed, when the interviews stretched into their third and fourth hours, pointed to the same remote stretch of the Kalahari Desert, roughly 80 kilometers southeast of the Botswana border. It was May of 2019 when the team finally made the journey. 3 decades had passed since the night the object allegedly came down. The landscape revealed nothing to casual observation, just endless waves of rust-colored sand punctuated by scattered acacia trees, and the occasional sun-bleached skeleton of some animal that had miscalculated the distance to walk. The emptiness felt deliberate somehow, as if the desert itself conspired to keep secrets. Mitchell's colleague, geologist Marcus Webb, had barely spoken since they left the main road 4 hours earlier. He sat in the back seat surrounded by detection equipment, watching the radiation counter with an intensity that suggested he expected it to tell him something the desert would not. The driver was a local guide named Thabo, a man in his late 50s whose father had herded cattle in this region before the fences went up, and the military declared certain areas restricted. Thabo spoke little English, but his nephew David translated, and it was David who first noticed the change in the landscape. He pointed through the dusty windshield at a circular area perhaps 40 meters in diameter, where the vegetation looked different. The acacia trees there grew twisted, their trunks bent at odd angles, their branches stunted and gnarled like arthritic fingers. Between them, patches of scrub brush barely reached knee height, whereas similar plants just outside this circle grew to shoulder level or higher. They stopped the vehicle at the edge of the circle. Mitchell stepped out into air that shimmered with midday heat. and immediately the hair on her arms stood up, not from static but from something else, some primal instinct that insisted this place was wrong. Webb emerged with his equipment, moving with the careful deliberation of someone entering a crime scene decades cold. The radiation counter began clicking almost immediately. Nothing alarming, but elevated above the background levels they had been recording all morning. He walked a careful grid pattern, taking readings every few meters, and the numbers told a story that made no natural sense. Peak radiation at the center of the circle, diminishing gradually toward the edges, as if something had been there at the epicenter, something hot and dangerous that had slowly leaked its poison into the surrounding earth. The sand itself provided the next piece of evidence. Mitchell knelt at the circle's center and brushed away the top layer of loose grains. Beneath, the sand had fused into irregular chunks of glassy material, pale green and translucent in places, opaque and bubbled in others. She had seen material like this only once before, in photographs from the Trinity test site in New Mexico, where the first atomic bomb had turned desert sand into a new mineral called trinitite. The process required temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Celsius. Lightning strikes could create fulgurites, branching tubes of fused sand, but not this. Not a sheet of it spread across dozens of square meters in a uniform layer. Webb used a small hammer to extract samples, wrapping each piece carefully in anti-static bags, labeled with GPS coordinates and timestamps. His hands shook slightly as he worked. Later, back at the vehicle, he would confide that the readings frightened him. Not because they were dangerous to human health at current levels, but because they suggested something had been there that should not exist outside of nuclear facilities or weapons tests. The isotopic signature would prove even more puzzling, but they did not know that yet. Not there in the desert with the sun climbing toward its zenith and the temperature pushing past 40 degrees. Thabo and David had wandered to the edge of the anomalous zone, speaking quietly in Setswana. David finally called out that his uncle wanted to tell them something. Through David's translation, the story emerged haltingly. Thabo's cousin still lived in a village 20 kilometers to the north. She was a teacher at the local school, a practical woman not given to superstition, but 3 times in the past year, she had seen lights in the night sky over this area. Not satellites or aircraft, she insisted, but lights that moved in ways that made no sense. Sudden right-angle turns, impossible accelerations, splitting into multiple points and then rejoining. Other villagers had seen them too. Some claimed their cell phones stopped working when the lights appeared. Screens going dark, batteries draining from full charge to nothing in seconds. Mitchell asked if they could visit this cousin, conduct an interview. Thabo nodded slowly, but his expression suggested reluctance, as if by speaking of these things they risked drawing unwanted attention. David said something about government people, military vehicles that sometimes appeared on the roads near here, watching. Mitchell exchanged glances with Webb. They had expected skepticism from locals, resistance born of isolation and mistrust of outsiders. They had not expected corroboration, certainly not reports that the activity, whatever it was, continued to this day. The real discovery came in the afternoon, as the heat began its slow retreat. Webb had brought ground-penetrating radar equipment, professional-grade gear that could map subsurface variations to a depth of several meters. He spent 2 hours walking transects across the circle while Mitchell recorded the data on a rugged laptop. The images that resolved on the screen showed exactly what they hoped for, and simultaneously dreaded. Buried approximately 1.2 meters below the surface, scattered across an area roughly matching the circle of stunted vegetation, were multiple metallic masses. Small, the largest perhaps the size of a soccer ball, but definitely metallic, definitely anomalous against the uniform sand matrix. They debated waiting until the next day to excavate, but the compulsion to know overwhelmed caution. Using folding shovels from the vehicle's emergency kit, they dug where the radar showed the clearest returns. The work was brutal in the residual heat, sand collapsing back into the hole, almost as fast as they could remove it. But at a depth of just over a meter, Webb's shovel struck something with a dull clang that sent a jolt of electricity through both researchers. The object was irregular, roughly pyramidal, about the size of a large grapefruit. Its surface was pitted and scarred, partially oxidized, but still showing patches of silvery metal beneath the corrosion. Webb lifted it carefully, cradling it like something precious or dangerous, or both. It was surprisingly heavy, denser than steel, denser than anything it resembled. They found 2 more fragments before the light began to fail, each one unique in shape but similar in surface characteristics and apparent composition. That night, camped several kilometers from the site, Mitchell couldn't sleep. The fragments sat in a locked equipment case, and she found herself staring at it in the darkness, listening to the absolute silence of the desert. No insects, no night birds, just wind hissing across sand, and the occasional crack of cooling metal from their vehicle. Webb was awake too, she could tell by his breathing. Nader spoke of what they were both thinking, that tomorrow they would need to get these samples out of the country and into a proper laboratory, that the analysis might reveal something that changed everything or nothing at all, that the weight of possibility pressed down like the darkness itself. The next day brought complications. They packed up at dawn, eager to begin the long drive back to civilization and proper facilities. But as they loaded the last of the equipment, Thabo pointed to the horizon behind them. A vehicle, still distant but unmistakable, raising a plume of dust that stood out against the morning sky. In this empty quarter of the Kalahari, on roads that saw traffic perhaps once a week, the appearance of another vehicle was no coincidence. They drove, not panicked, not racing, but with purpose. The other vehicle maintained its distance, never closing enough for them to make out details, never falling so far back as to lose visual contact. It followed them for 3 hours, through terrain where there were no coincidental routes, no innocent explanations. At the point where they finally rejoined a maintained road, the pursuing vehicle stopped on a ridge perhaps 2 kilometers back. Mitchell watched through binoculars as 2 figures emerged, standing beside their truck, watching. Even at this distance, even through the shimmering heat distortion, she could make out what looked like military uniforms, the angular shapes of radio antennas extending from their vehicle. At the border crossing into South Africa, the inspectors spent an unusually long time examining their documentation. Questions were asked about their purpose in Botswana, their profession, whether they had collected any samples. Mitchell lied smoothly, said they were conducting routine geological surveys, academic research, nothing of commercial or strategic value. The equipment cases were opened and examined, but cursory searches revealed nothing unusual. The metallic fragments were wrapped in sleeping bags at the bottom of a duffel, and either luck or lack of thoroughness saw them through. Later analysis at a private laboratory in Johannesburg would reveal the fragments' true strangeness. The metallic composition was not exotic, primarily titanium and aluminum with trace elements, but the isotopic ratios were wrong. Titanium exists naturally in 5 stable isotopes, and their relative abundances are consistent across all terrestrial samples, whether ore from Australia or metal from Russia. These fragments showed ratios that deviated from those norms, not wildly, but measurably, significantly. The implications were troubling in their ambiguity. Natural processes could not explain the deviation, but neither could any known manufacturing technique. The material had been processed, certainly, but by methods or in environments that left signatures unlike anything in the reference databases. Back in the Kalahari, the site sits empty under the relentless sun. Mitchell knows this because she checked the satellite imagery, commercial platforms that update every few weeks. In images from 6 months after their visit, she spotted vehicle tracks near the circle, patterns suggesting systematic excavation. Something or someone had returned to dig where they had dug, to search for what they had found. The implications haunted her more than the fragments themselves. After 30 years, someone still cared enough to monitor this remote location, to investigate investigators, to erase or remove whatever evidence remained. The final detail came from David, the translator, who sent an encrypted email 8 months after their expedition. His uncle Thabo had been visited by men in civilian clothes who asked questions about the foreigners, what they were looking for, what they had taken. The men were polite but insistent, and they left Thabo with the strong impression that discussing their visit with anyone else would be unwise. David himself had been approached at his workplace in Gaborone, the same questions, the same polite menace. He was writing to warn them, he said, and to ask them not to contact him again. So the fragments sit in a safe deposit box, their secrets only partially revealed. The fused sand and radiation readings exist as data on encrypted drives, corroborated but unexplained. And in the Kalahari, the circle of stunted trees continues its slow struggle toward normalcy, while overhead, If the reports are true, strange lights still trace impossible paths across the emptiness of the night sky. More than 3 decades have passed since that autumn night in 1989, when something streaked across the southern African sky and crashed into the Kalahari Desert. Yet every attempt to uncover the truth has met with silence, denial, or heavily redacted documents. The questions that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the incident remain as unanswered today as they were when the recovery teams first departed the crash site under cover of darkness. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this enduring mystery is the systematic intimidation of witnesses. Why would individuals who merely saw lights in the sky or military convoys on desert roads find themselves visited by men in suits who warned them to forget what they had seen? Farmers who reported the incident, air traffic controllers who tracked the object, journalists who attempted to investigate the story all encountered the same chilling message: speak no further about what happened that night. This pattern of witness suppression suggests something far more significant than the recovery of routine space debris or a failed satellite. When a government expends resources to silence ordinary citizens discussing a supposed non-event, the very act of suppression becomes evidence that something extraordinary occurred. The electromagnetic effects documented that night defy conventional explanation. Multiple vehicles near the crash site experienced complete electrical failure simultaneously. Radio communications across a wide area were disrupted for hours. These phenomena align more closely with accounts from other unexplained aerial incidents than with the characteristics of re-entering spacecraft or conventional aircraft accidents. If the object was merely a Soviet satellite falling back to Earth, as some official sources suggested, what mechanism could account for such widespread electronic interference? Satellites re-enter the atmosphere regularly without causing localized electromagnetic pulses strong enough to disable vehicle systems on the ground. Then there is the question that haunts every investigation into this incident. Where is the object now? Something was recovered that night. The military presence was too extensive, too organized, too urgent to have been a mere training exercise or a response to space junk. Witnesses described heavy lifting equipment, specialized transport vehicles, and a security perimeter that extended for miles. Objects were removed from the crash site and transported away under military escort. Yet, in all the years since, no government has acknowledged possession of whatever fell that night. It was not displayed in a museum, not analyzed in published scientific papers, not mentioned in official space agency records of satellite debris recovery. The object simply vanished into the classified world, and with it went any chance of definitive answers. The theories that have emerged to fill the void left by official silence each carry their own compelling arguments and troubling implications. The extraterrestrial hypothesis remains the most sensational, suggesting that an alien craft either malfunctioned or was brought down by terrestrial intervention. Proponents point to the electromagnetic effects, the shape of the object as described by witnesses, and the extreme secrecy surrounding the recovery as evidence that something beyond human origin was retrieved. The alternative explanations, however, prove equally unsettling in their own ways. Could this have been experimental Soviet technology gone astray in the final days of the Cold War? The timing coincides with a period of technological competition and desperation in Moscow as the Soviet Union's collapse accelerated. Perhaps an advanced aircraft or weapons system being tested over remote Soviet territory malfunctioned and traveled thousands of miles off course before falling into the Kalahari. The joint recovery operation would then represent a covert agreement between superpowers to prevent such technology from falling into other hands. Yet this theory struggles to explain why such secrecy would need to persist decades after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Some researchers suggest the object may have been classified American technology, a black project aircraft or spacecraft whose existence remains unknown to the public even today. The involvement of American personnel in the recovery operation lends credence to this possibility. If a highly classified aerospace vehicle crashed in southern Africa during a test flight, the United States would have powerful incentives to recover it quickly and ensure that all evidence disappeared. The persistent classification of documents related to the incident could reflect ongoing programs that trace their lineage back to whatever technology was being tested that night. A particularly intriguing theory proposes that South Africa itself possessed advanced aerospace capabilities unknown to the wider world. During the apartheid era, the nation maintained sophisticated weapons programs and scientific facilities, some of which remain mysterious to this day. Could the Kalahari incident represent the crash of a domestically developed experimental craft, with American assistance in the recovery operation provided as part of secret technology sharing agreements? This would explain both the location of the crash and the involvement of multiple national governments in suppressing information about it. The most cynical interpretation suggests the entire incident was an elaborate disinformation exercise, a Cold War psychological operation designed to achieve objectives we may never understand. Perhaps there was no exotic craft at all, merely a staged event meant to distract attention from other activities or to test public reaction to reports of unusual aerial phenomena. Yet this theory, like all the others, crumbles when confronted with the physical evidence that something tangible was removed from the desert that night. Freedom of information requests filed in both South Africa and the United States have yielded virtually nothing. Documents are denied, declared lost, or released with every meaningful detail redacted into black bars and white spaces. The very existence of heavily censored files confirms that official records of the incident exist, locked away in archives where they may remain for generations. Even researchers who have spent years pursuing this case through legal channels have been stonewalled at every turn. The message from authorities on both continents remains consistent. Whatever happened in the Kalahari in 1989 is none of the public's concern. As witnesses age and memories fade, as classification periods extend and archives remain sealed, the truth recedes further into the shadows. We are left with fragments, light in the sky, military convoys in the desert, silenced witnesses, and classified files. Something fell from the heavens that night, something important enough to justify decades of secrecy spanning 2 continents. Whether it came from another world, from the cutting edge of human technology, or from somewhere in between, we may never know. The answers exist, preserved in locked filing cabinets and password-protected databases, guarded by classification stamps and official denial deed. The Kalahari incident endures as a perfect mystery, a question mark written in the sand and erased by official hands before anyone could photograph it. The truth is out there perhaps, but it remains beyond our reach, locked away in the classified darkness where secrets go to die. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.